Welcome to Evolve to Succeed, the podcast that brings together entrepreneurs, founders, business leaders and experts to talk about their journeys and explore the link between personal and business success. I'm your host, Warren Munson, founder of Evolve, a coaching, training and development company focused on enabling business and personal success and creating a community of like-minded individuals. Whether that be through our peer groups, one-to-one coaching, our training and development programs for you and your teams, or through our content and events, our mission is to get the best out of each individual and inspire them to be better both in life and in business. If you want to learn more about Evolve, including our beautiful co-working space in Ashley Cross in Poole, then please go to evolvemembers.com, where you'll find great content, insights, details of all of our services, and also information on our forthcoming events. For now though, let's get on with the show. Welcome to this week's episode. Today I'm talking to Morag Ofili, founder of Kiltered, a diversity and inclusion company that helps startups and SMEs promote better diversity and inclusion policies and increase business performance as a result. I'm sure that we all acknowledge both the need and benefits of a more diverse and inclusive workforce. However, many don't really know how to go about it and implement in a truly effective way. Kiltered uses organisational psychology and data analytics to enable inclusiveness, and I was fascinated to find out how they go about doing this. Amongst other things, Morag and I discussed the effects the Great Resignation has had on driving diversity and inclusion, the vulnerability of stepping out of your familiar profession into entrepreneurialism, and the significant influence Gen Z has had on igniting real and sustained change. It is a really interesting and revealing discussion. I do hope you enjoyed this episode. Welcome to the Evolve to Succeed podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on the podcast. I'm really keen to learn a bit about you and your background and all of the things that you get up to, but the main focus of this conversation is going to be about diversity and inclusion and your business Kiltered. So tell our listeners, to set a bit of the scene, a little bit about Kiltered and what inspired you to set it up.
Sure. So Kiltered is a strategic advisory firm that uses organizational psychology and data analytics to help businesses take the fear out of building inclusive workplaces. The name of the business comes from the phrase off kilter, because I feel like many businesses are off kilter in their approach to D&I, often focusing on the external marketing piece and not giving enough time and attention to the internal culture. So really it was just to create a platform to have the kind of uncomfortable conversations required for real rather than performative change.
Yeah, which is really interesting, isn't it? And do you really think that is an issue within, I suppose, the UK generally, but Kiltered specialises in that SME market where there's a lot done around D&I to win tenders, to be seen to be doing the right thing rather than actually implementing the right policies? Yeah,
I think that's right. I mean, I think if we look at, the last kind of 18 months to 2 years and the Great Resignation, I mean, a core part of the decision making for many employees is culture. And wanting to find a better culture and a better fit for themselves. And so ultimately, if you have people kind of voting with their feet and moving to somewhere else where they perceive the culture to be better, I think it is a sign that there is something to be said about the ability for everyone who works within your organisation to feel like they belong and that organisation works for them.
Yeah, no, definitely. So do you work with other sort of culture consultants to do the full culture piece and you focus on the D&I, or do you bring the D&I into that whole culture discussion? How do you work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the way that I focus with my clients is mainly on the inclusion piece. I think ultimately if you want to build a culture that works, you have to think about how everybody associates and identifies with that culture. Where needed, Kiltered has a directory of different advisors that I can pull in for different projects. So I'm really keen to tell clients from the outset, I'm not an expert in everything. I don't profess to be an expert in everything. But the key function of Kiltered's business is strategy. So we help people get that first strategy onto paper. Because I find with a lot of SMEs, they do what they do very well and they run their businesses very well, but they have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to D&I, and they have a bit of a discomfort about putting a plan together. And so really the role of Kiltered and myself is to help them with that initial plan. It may be that in doing so, we identify that they need help in other areas of culture or business, and we have people that we can point them to. But I don't profess to do the entire piece.
The whole package, as it were. And do you think there is because most D&I is very much talked about within with big corporates, public sector, charitable sector, clearly. And most things cascade down into that kind of owner-managed SME kind of market. Are you now seeing an increased desire by SMEs to really engage in D&I discussions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I took the decision to focus primarily, almost exclusively on SMEs, because we have this kind of strange phenomenon where you have the 1%, the big businesses who only make up 1% of the business population, dictating the business policies and practices of the 99%. And the reality of the situation is, for most small businesses in the UK, they don't have the budget or the scope or the scale to put in place the same things that the big businesses do. And so I think there's been a lot of failed initiatives, not because people didn't have the best intentions, but they're looking to the wrong places. And so I think people are starting to realise that it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and that the SME market does require its own methodologies around improving D&I. I mean, some clients will go in and say, oh, well, I want to try and hire 10 women in the next X months. And you go, well, hang on a second, your entire workforce is 15 people. You've got to just take a step back and look at the realities for your business. And so I think a lot of SMEs are starting to realize, this is important. It matters. If you want to continue to be a player in the market and retain your market share, attract good talent, it's something that you can't ignore. And so I think it's been put in the kind of do later pile. And I think it's now being transferred into that actually we have to do now. So that's what I think is driving a lot of the conversations around D&I for SMEs. So
you really think the SME market and SMEs starting to engage properly in those conversations, as you said earlier, is about, we've had the Great Resignation. There is a lack of talent out there. You think it's now come to the point where it's being commercially driven?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies realize that, even in my own experience, when you interview people, one of the first questions they ask you is, what's the culture like?
Yeah.
I read somewhere in a recent study that it costs the average business about £30,000 when someone leaves, when you factor in recruitment costs, training costs, and the skills gap that you have until that new person is up to speed. And so we are living in a time of financial crisis, following the pandemic. And so those type of numbers hit smaller businesses more so than the bigger businesses. Yeah. And so if you have an issue which is related to your culture, if you're not tapping into innovation because you don't have diversity in your workforce, it's a financial problem as well as a moral and cultural one. And I think those are starting to come together as one issue rather than being separate strands.
And if they do, that's great, because that drives change, doesn't it?
Yeah, agreed.
Drives right.
I think we shouldn't be afraid of acknowledging that diversity and inclusion is good for business.
Absolutely.
The studies show that. I mean, there could also be a moral imperative, but it's also okay if there's a commercial imperative too.
Yeah, and unfortunately, sometimes it is the commercial desire and outcome and reasons that drive necessarily and required change, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we've got to, you've got to put everything in context. We're talking about businesses here. It's, the drivers from a personal point of view might be very different from a commercial point of view. But I think, businesses are there to succeed and be profitable and grow. And if this is a factor that can help them do that, and people acknowledge that and invest in it properly, then that is a good thing.
So I'm just intrigued to what really inspired you to set it up, because you're very successful in your own right. Won personal awards, within your personal services kind of career, which you're still participating in and undertaking. So what really inspired you to start Kiltered alongside that very successful professional services career? Morag?
It's a very good question. I've been involved in diversity and inclusion initiatives for many, many years. And so I've been engaged in kind of several different iterations of Kiltered over the years, just not formally through my own business. So the pandemic, if I'm being honest, I think was a real time of reflection for all of us. And it gave me the kind of time and space to kind of take a step back and think about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to move this forward. And I felt that the best way to honor my passion and commitment to diversity and inclusion was to basically go public. I think there's sometimes a vulnerability around starting a business and saying out loud to people, this is something I'm doing. I think a lot of entrepreneurs kind of start in the shadows and are afraid to kind of tell people. And so there was a real desire to just kind of be honest and be bold and say, this is what I'm doing and I want to help people, and if people want my services, here they are. So yeah, it's been, you know, the response has been great. I have to say, you know, my employer has also been great in allowing me to pursue this alongside my legal career. Which
forward thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, which is quite rare. I know a lot of people still you know, part of the reason some people are so quiet about it is they don't have the support of their employer. So I'm very grateful to that extent that they get it and they support it and they applaud it. So I'm very lucky, but it was really just a timing thing of, you know, if not now, when?
Yeah, and as you say, you know, that entrepreneurial mind, sometimes we've got a desire to do things, but we don't take that first step, do we?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the first step is the hardest, actually.
Absolutely.
Just kind of putting yourself out there. It's a type of vulnerability and exposure that I think you don't really understand until you start that entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah. Did you think there's, from your own personal perspective, that, you know, clearly when people, you know, look at you on LinkedIn, they'll see, Morag, that those personal awards and that achievement that you've had in a successful career. Do you think it was a bigger step, therefore, to then be more vulnerable and step out and do Kiltered? Because you had all of that success, and then to go and do something and risk something that then says, well, this may or may not work.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people will question kind of, but why? You know, you're doing well in one lane. Why are you pursuing something else? But I think, you know, we're people are multifaceted, you know, and I think when you work in the professional services sector, you know, I think people tend to define you by your professional title and your career, and it's important to recognize that we are, you know, I'm more than just a lawyer. I have other interests, and you know, I think it's about being okay with that, and I think that is quite a new thing within the professions. I think, you know, if we just go back 5-10 years ago, you know, people would be aghast that someone would even consider talking about something that wasn't, you know, law or their primary profession, or having other interests that they pursue. So for me, yeah, I mean, I'm very lucky that I've had a really, touch wood, thus far, a successful legal career. But I like challenge, and this is something that's always been important to me. And so this starting my own business was the ultimate challenge. And so I'm glad that I took that risk.
Do you think it's made you, I asked this from a personal perspective, because obviously, you know, come from a professional services background and have started a number of ventures. So I know what my answer to this is, but do you think it's made you a sharper professional starting your own business?
Absolutely. I think a lot of lawyers, myself included, they think they're commercial.
Yeah.
But maybe we're not as commercial as we really are. I mean, I think, you know, we're involved in transactions, but often we're not there when the deal gets made, you know?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of different factors that go into making a successful business over and above the kind of the contracts and the agreements that codify them. And so it has really made me look at everything differently, from just kind of, you know, how we engage with clients, or, you know, what we're spending on, you know, pads of paper and pens, and just really thinking about, you know, the kind of the wider picture of what goes into why we charge what we charge, what goes into how we network and we raise our profile and engage with clients. I think that the skills that I've learned in law have really helped me with Kiltered, but I think equally the skills that I've learned with Kiltered have made me a better lawyer in terms of understanding the business of law, which I think we don't really, I think as you kind of climb through your career, you don't really get exposure to the business of law until you're senior enough to see it. And so actually to be able to understand those things at a slightly earlier stage, because I run my own business, has been really enlightening, actually.
Absolutely, completely agree. I think the other ventures I did alongside being a professional just gave me that empathy, because I absolutely started to understand that sometimes you're making a decision to turn left or right, and you'd think, well, the client's definitely going to go and turn right at this juncture, and they turn left, and you're like, right. And as soon as you start running your own business or doing other things, you start to have that empathy and understanding of why decisions sometimes get made.
Yeah, agreed.
But this conversation was supposed to be about D&I, wasn't it? So let's get back to D&I. An interesting tangent, I hope, for our listeners. So how much progress do you think the UK in particular has made over the last decade with regards to D&I, and what more needs to be done to accelerate it, Morag?
I think there has been quite a lot of progress in the last 10 years, mainly because we're talking about it more, and that in and of itself is progress. I think where we are now is we need more action, and people need to kind of listen more. I mean, it's one thing if people are talking, but we need to really listen to what people are saying. So it's not, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think there is progress, but I think a lot of people are kind of slightly disappointed by the pace of that progress. And I guess just to kind of accelerate progress, I think really what we're talking about, which is why it's so hard, is a mindset shift. It's very hard. Change is hard. Humans don't like change. We enjoy the status quo. We're comfortable in our comfort zones. And so what we're really talking about here is a real mindset shift in terms of how we structure our businesses and how we treat our people. And some people will take a little bit more persuading than others to get that over the line. And that is a difficult process. And I don't think something that happens overnight.
And in all of your experiences, do you think some industries are better at D&I than others?
I don't think it's necessarily industry focused, but I do think those organizations that pride themselves on innovation seem to be ahead of the curve. Because, the research tells us that, the more diversity you have in your organization, the more people feel like they belong and contribute, the bigger the innovation, the bigger the returns on that. And so I think if you are in an industry which prides itself on that innovation, I think they've realized now, actually, if we want to be pitching, a broader range of ideas, we need more people to feel like they can contribute to that. Certain industries where they feel like we've been doing it fine for the last 100 million years, we don't need to change.
Always be the same,
Then, of course, they don't see the value in it from a commercial point of view, which goes back to what you were saying. Is it bad that it's a commercial driver? I don't think it's necessarily bad. It just is what it is. But you will have certain organizations who neither see the commercial benefits or the cultural or moral benefits. And so from that point of view, it's going to be very hard to try and move them forward.
And I suppose does that come with generational change as well? Would you agree that perhaps, the current generation, those coming into the workplace now, are just more aware of the importance of inclusiveness and therefore best equipped to move things forward? Yeah,
I mean, Gen Z are the most diverse generation in history. So it stands to reason that these matters mean something to them more so than they have done previously. We're also in a slightly odd phase in history where we've got so many generations in the workplace at one time. So you have a kind of, we're watching the changing of the guard, which is a really interesting thing to actually observe and participate in. And I think what makes Gen Z so interesting is just they're fearless, they are prepared to take action to affect change in ways that potentially previous organizations wouldn't. I know many of my counterparts, you would apply for a job and you would hear that place has a really bad reputation. And you'd say, well, but it's good on your CV. Stick it out for a little while.
Yeah.
Just do it. We know they're terrible. They're not going to change, but just do it. And in fact, we may have gotten that same advice from our parents, It was a case of just, suck it up, move on. Gen Z won't even touch an organisation if they're not diverse enough or inclusive enough. They won't engage with organisations that don't share the same values as them. And so all of a sudden, something that was just seen as, well, just accept it and move on, is now a non-negotiable. And so Which is
great, because suck it up isn't kind of the right approach to anything, is it?
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're terrified of Gen Z, but I think, they are the future. We've got a lot to learn from them. And so I think if businesses want to stay relevant and have that longevity, they need to really think about how they engage that new, their future workers.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose with Gen Z, that must lead on to a discussion around social media, really, doesn't it? And what do you think both the positive and negative effect of social media have on driving inclusion and diversity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm what they call a geriatric millennial. So I'm
trying to age you with that, which I shouldn't do.
So I remember life pre and post kind of the boom of all these various different platforms. So I'm a complete Luddite. I fully accept that. But I think the benefit of social media is it just brings attentions to issues like at a pace we've never seen before. And I think a perfect example of that was, the horrific murder of George Floyd, during the lockdown. I mean, that type of story or video or imagery would not have gotten the attention that it rightly deserved if it wasn't for the power of social media and the power of Gen Z and their social activism. So there is positive in it, because the impact of that was the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and a real conversation, although some might say not far enough, but a real conversation about how we treat black people and policing and police brutality. So it did start a conversation. Potentially the conversation died a bit earlier than some people would have liked, but it definitely started a conversation. I think the negative of social media in a kind of diversity and inclusion context is it's this kind of passive activism that some people talk about, which is often referred to as slacktivism.
Okay.
Which is
haven't heard that term before. Slacktivism.
Yeah, it's people refer to it as kind of lazy activism. It's like, oh yeah, I like to post. Yeah, okay, I did this, but am I really engaging?
I'm doing my bit because I like to post.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's kind of it's about the psychology of what's the good deed I'm doing? Is the good deed liking a post and sharing a post, or is it actually taking those ideals into my personal life and living by them or trying to evoke real change? I think the reality is it's very difficult to know from one campaign to a next which one is going to be the one that really takes off. So I think it is a bit unfair sometimes to critique that type of action, because it does bring awareness. But for every kind of, if you recall the ice bucket challenge, which kind of just went viral and raised a lot of awareness and money for a very good cause, there are other types of campaigns, such as the Black Square on Instagram that people did after George Floyd's murder, which just didn't land. And people were saying, well, actually, that's lazy. What else are you doing? We don't want to see big brands just putting up black squares. It's not enough.
Yeah.
So it's a really fine line, and I think in the moment, it's getting harder and harder to know which kind of horse to back when it comes to social media activism. But I guess as long as you're not performative in your actions, you don't really have anything to fear,
No.
And so I recall a lot of people calling out a lot of brands and saying, well, that's a really lovely marketing campaign, but release the diversity stats for your board level. Let's talk real here. If you're saying these things matter to you, be transparent about your figures or your policies. And I think as long as you can put your money where your mouth is, and that's really what Kiltered's about, just bringing that balance between the external and the internal message, then social media is a very good tool. Yeah,
and I think that's what's hit home to me about what Kiltered is and what Kiltered does, is like you say, I mean, particularly on social media, those external marketing campaigns, all of the big corporates get behind, don't they? But like you say, it's does your internal narrative, does your internal systems, procedures, and the way in which you behave internally in your culture reflect that?
Yeah, I mean, Pride Month is a perfect example. So many people put rainbows up for Pride Month, and or offer discounts or whatever it might be. But I'd be asking, do you contribute to any LGBTQ plus charities? Do you take those profits and do something good with them? What is the experience of people from that group within your organization? What policies and initiatives do you have in place to make people feel included and to create and foster that culture of inclusion over and above a rainbow once a year? It's asking those tough questions and saying, if you can't back it up, we are a much more kind of galvanized group of critics because of social media, that you need to be prepared that there is the potential for backlash, and there is the potential that if you don't have enough people challenging your views, or enough people from diverse backgrounds kind of questioning, well, why are you doing this, or who is your audience? It's then when companies, it just falls flat, it's tone deaf, they say something they shouldn't have said, and it's because they didn't have the right people in the room.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And in terms of, a big part of Kiltered is installing that culture. So what do you think some of the biggest barriers are to an SME in particular installing a culture of inclusion and diversity in the workplace?
I think for a lot of SMEs, one of the biggest barriers, I think, is the businesses are quite small, and so it's seen as not a business priority. And so the focus is on customers, it's on employees, it's kind of, this doesn't impact us, we're not big enough for this to have an impact. So it's really trying to explain, it doesn't matter what size your business is or where in the UK you are. I mean, some people think it's more of a London issue rather than anywhere else. I mean, and I grew up in Edinburgh, and I have clients all over the UK, but it's not about particularly looking at a set of characteristics and saying, well, we're in this area, there aren't that many black people to hire, so this isn't an issue for us, it's fine, we'll keep going. It's more about taking a step back and saying, but actually, what are the experiences of the people that you have here? And do they feel like they belong? Because inclusion is an everybody issue. Yeah. And so it's about, well, what is your actual culture? And what's your plan for growth in the future? If you're planning to target new markets and reach new people, and your voices are all the same, you're missing a trick here. So you've got to be thinking about the culture from the outset, regardless of your size or your location. I think the other barrier is fear. I think so many businesses worry about, well, what if I get it wrong? Or what if it doesn't work? Or if I spend this money and I don't see the outcomes that I want? Or what if there's backlash? Or one of the bigger fears that comes up quite a lot is, what if we alienate our existing customers? Which I find mad. Like, why would it alienate your existing customers if internally you were just a little bit nicer to your staff and treated them with respect, and they didn't leave and they had a good time there? I don't see how that would alienate customers, but that comes up a lot.
Does it?
Yeah, which I find quite interesting. Or the other one is just, this is a distraction. It's a distraction from the day job. Yeah. But ultimately, I think, fear is an interesting thing, because it kind of holds you back in ways that are kind of psychological. That a lot of the time it's imagined. Sometimes it's not as real as you think it is. And even in the face of studies that show time and time again that a lot of those fears are just will not come to fruition, I think a lot of businesses kind of really want to hold that front line of, this isn't right for us, thanks but no thanks. And so that's the organizational psychology bit. And so I really work with leadership teams to get that mindset shift from the top. Okay.
So if a business owner, business leaders listen to this, they run an SME, what are the first steps that business can take right now to be more inclusive and diverse?
I think the most important step is understand where your business is at now. Don't just pick some random ideas off a shelf that you've Googled and you think, oh, that might work. I think a lot of businesses assume that they know what the problems are, when actually they don't know what the problems in their business are, or the problems are never as bad as they thought they were.
Right. So audit, effectively.
So yeah, that first audit, understand where you are so that you can progress and measure as you go on. Because I think without it, it's very easy to just give up, because you don't actually see the progress that's been made because you never really marked that starting point.
Yeah. Okay. So that's it. Again, it comes back to one of the other conversations we were having earlier on a completely different topic. Take the first step and work out where you are.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any well-known companies that you think are actually, either in the UK or globally, that you think are a great example of D&I?
And that's a tough one. I mean, because we're talking about this kind of what we see externally and what happens internally, it's very difficult to know whether what an organisation is saying about its inclusivity is actually the experience of people within it.
Of course.
So I think with that disclaimer,
which is quite a big one, but an acceptable one, an understanded one.
One organisation that I've been lucky enough to be supported by in the early stages of my business is Bloomberg.
Okay.
And I'm just really impressed at the way that they approach D&I. It's something that they acknowledged that they needed to do better on a few years ago, and then they did it, which is great.
They got on and did it.
And then from speaking to staff there, the staff that I spoke to, it just seemed like a really positive experience, and the real trust and the commitment that leadership had put into improving diversity and inclusion.
Okay. So there was belief, I mean, that's a big organisation, and there was a belief, top down, bottom up, that leadership was taking it seriously and doing things to implement change. Yeah,
I really felt that from the people that I engaged with in that business.
And in your own case, in terms of Kiltered, is there any case studies that, maybe you can't name names, but is there any case studies of things that you've seen and change that Kiltered's made happen within organisations that you would be relevant to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the main change, which is one of the core aims of Kiltered, is just to facilitate conversations. I think so many people are afraid to talk about D&I. It's kind of like, we many of us were taught when we were younger, you don't talk about money. It's just rude to talk about money, and that fear around the conversation has prevented a lot of people from, asking for the pay rise that they need, or, understanding their financial security, etc. So I think there are a number of clients that I have worked with where I'm just absolutely staggered that they've gone from not talking about diversity and inclusion at all to, by getting the tools to have those conversations with their staff, really encouraging those type of conversations and learning from them. And so that for me is the biggest change, that overnight actually they're creating forums where people can come up and say things, which I think is quite powerful, because they realize actually my fear of what this person was going to say is greater than what they actually had to say. Yeah. And so once you kind of crack that nut, because one of the things that Kiltered does is I have regular check-ins with the companies that I work with. So we have an early strategy building phase, and then I leave you alone. It's your business, it's your strategy, but I'll come back quarterly and hold you accountable. We'll get the strategy out and we'll say, well, what's working, what's not working, do we need to adjust it? And part of that is about getting people comfortable with failure and adjustment. We're not going to get it right first time. Businesses very rarely do. That would be like, in your first year of business, if you don't make the spend that you want, just saying, well, let's just wrap it all up and give up now. No, you have to look at the numbers. You have to look at the numbers, you've got to tweak, you've got to adjust, and then see if it's improved and kind of find the problem, fix the leak, and move on. So it's in those check-ins that I really see the progress, because it happens, it happens on an internal level. It doesn't happen with me. And so it's when I get those feedback points, it's really nice. And, some clients share with me the emails that they've gotten from staffs saying, this has been such a marked difference. I'm so proud to work here. I'm really glad that you're investing in it. And those emails are really why I do it. It's really quite powerful, the change that people see when leadership engage.
Yeah, for you, that must be the thing, that puts a smile on your face, that actually Kiltered is impacting, it's making change happen, it's having an effect in terms of the clients and customers that you work with. Yeah,
because I mean, whilst ostensibly the client is usually the leadership team of the business, the impact is felt by the employees. if through one small initiative, you can make somebody's just day-to-day work experience a little bit better. I mean, that's the dream.
And the one thing you've said a couple of times, and it's really hit home with me, is across different subjects and a variety of different things, within a business, sustainability might be another kind of one of those topics. But with D&I, there is a real fear about getting it wrong. So therefore, you don't take the first step. You don't do that audit. You don't listen. You just huddle back. Businesses just huddle back down and think, okay, I'll say the right things externally, but not necessarily make change internally. Is there anything that you've seen that you've done that's really enabled that senior leadership team to overcome that fear to really take that first step?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is just admitting it.
Yeah.
So I always do an early session with just the leadership team.
Okay.
And just, I just say, listen, let's just get it all out on the table. It's almost like a therapy session, There's no judgment, just let's get it all out. Let's talk about,
say it as it is.
Exactly. Yep. And just actually being in a room, I think, where they can just say their fears out loud and have that, have no judgment, and have someone sitting there going, that's a completely, justifiable fear, and I understand that, but can I suggest something else, It's that kind of, I said the thing that I've been thinking out loud, and, the sky didn't fall down, and I wasn't, labeled a racist or a sexist or a pig or whatever it might be. And it's really just saying, your feelings are valid here. I think sometimes we kind of villainize people for having a contrary view. And, I think that kind of polarization is making discourse harder. And so actually, I think it's important. It makes me do my job better, hearing those views, so that I can understand what the real issues are for businesses. What
the opinions or views, right or wrong, of people running businesses are.
Yeah, exactly. I think, you don't have to validate them, but I think you have to acknowledge that everybody's opinion is valid. And so how do you deal with that? And so that's the first step, really getting to the crux of that fear. And then that's my job to try and build an approach that recognizes that. So, some clients are really, really fearful. So, I'm not going to do anything too, too exciting or dramatic or racy, because I'm going to lose them straight away. So it's really understanding where they are on that scale and working within that and building incrementally.
Which is great, yeah. So you create the safe space and then work out the size of steps that they can take on their
exactly, because it's key to me as well. I mean, I know that it's a serious topic, but I try and have as much fun with it as possible. I try and be as positive as possible. I'm not here to kind of shame anyone. I try and avoid actually using a lot of diversity and inclusion language, because again, if it's something you're not comfortable with, teaching someone a language and words that they don't understand to understand a concept that's already a little bit strange to them, it creates a further barrier for them to think, well, this isn't for me. So what I try and do is actually keep things in commercial terms, because that they understand. So we talk about the impact on the business, we talk about innovation, we talk about profits and productivity, we talk about staff absenteeism, we talk about connecting with clients. We talk about appraisals and feedback systems. We use all the systems and tools that are probably already in the business. And then, shock, horror, surprise, surprise, we're actually talking about D&I, and they're comfortable with it. For people who, parental leave is a D&I issue.
Yeah.
Flexi working is a D&I issue.
Absolutely.
Gender pay gap is a D&I issue. And they're all things you're comfortable talking about. So let's just open the net a little bit further, and really think about how we can make sure those issues which were brought in place to make work a better place for certain people from certain groups, let's just think about that for other groups as well.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Morag, I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's been inspirational to hear your views on what Kiltered is doing. If people want to hear more about Kiltered, learn more about you, where can they go?
They can go to our website, www.kiltered.co.uk, also on Twitter @WeAreKiltered, and we're also on Instagram @WeAreKiltered.
Fantastic. Thank you for being a great guest on the Evolve to Succeed podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Evolve to Succeed podcast. My hope with every episode is that you've learned something new or heard something that challenged your way of thinking and further motivated you on your path towards becoming a more knowledgeable, informed and inspired individual and business leader. If you enjoyed this episode, then please help us by rating, reviewing and subscribing. We really value your feedback and would love to have you along for future episodes. And please don't forget to learn more about Evolve by going to evolvemembers.com. Thank you for listening. See you next week.